is Heritage Words, a podcast about the words we've inherited from our ancestors and the meaning they bring to our lives. Heritage Words is produced by the HUC-JIR Jewish Language Project, which raises awareness about Jewish ancestral diversity through the lens of language. I'm your host, Sarah Bunin Benor. Today, I am very happy to have with us our guest, Asher Shasho Levy. Asher is a Syrian Jewish musician who sings and plays many instruments, including oud. He's done so much to raise awareness about the Sephardic tradition through his scholarship and his performance. I personally first encountered Asher when he was an undergraduate student at the University of Southern California, and he did an internship in hazanut, or cantorial music, at my synagogue, Ikar, in Los Angeles. And that was the first time that I heard Haftorah recited in a tradition other than the Ashkenazi one that I grew up with, and I loved it. Later, Asher served as artist in residence at Valley Beth Shalom Synagogue, and I also invited him to do research and several performances for the HUC Jewish Language Project, including performing at our launch event, Passover Around the World, in 2020. Asher now lives in San Francisco, where he is the hazan and musical director at The Kitchen, a progressive Jewish community. He's also the leader of the Aram Soba ensemble, a group dedicated to the musical heritage of Syrian Jewry. Asher, welcome to Heritage Words.
Thank you, Sarah. What a joy.
So I want to start by asking you about your name or your names.
Yes.
Tell us where your names come from and what they mean to you.
So my full name is Asher Isaac Shasho Levy. And so my first name, Asher in Hebrew, is named in honor of my maternal grandfather of blessed memory, Al Avraham. My middle name, Isaac Yitzhak, is named after my paternal grandfather of blessed memory, Isaac Shasho Levy, who was also known as Irving during his life, Zaki, a lot of different names. So when I was born, my parents, my mom is Ashkenazi and my dad is Syrian. And so when they named me, they wanted to honor both conventions. So at the time, my juddo, my grandfather, I'll be talking a lot about during the course of this interview today. He was alive, and so I was named Yitzhak to honor him, as the Syrian Sephardic tradition is to name after living grandparents. And my first name, Asher, was in honor of my mom's father, who had passed away, and to honor the Ashkenazi custom of naming after deceased relatives. And my last name, Shasho Levy, it's not actually a hyphenated name between my mom's name and my dad's name. It's actually all my dad's family name. So we are a family of Leviim, so Levites who have that tradition from the ancient times. And in many communities, Levi, because it's a tribal designation, it could be a last name, but it also could be something that was more of a ritual designation, and people would have another last name that would reflect their trade or their position in the community. And so that's what Shasho is. Shasho is a name that I believe has to do with working with fabrics, and our family took, I believe it was in the 19th century. We did some research as to when that name was taken. There was another branch of the family that had the name Tuwashi, or Tuvashi, it became in Turkey, which I believe has to do with being guards. So there was a switch in the family name that had to do with switch in profession, and so those are my names, and it tells quite a story. Shasho, I'm not even sure what I think it's Arabic, but you can also find many non-Jewish Kurdish people with the name Shasho, and so I've always wondered if there's any connection there, because the Shashos tend to come from one region. But if you meet anyone Jewish with the last name Shasho, that's my family. There's one Jewish Shasho family.
Okay. So, and what was your mom's maiden name?
My mom's maiden name was Steinman.
And so your dad's side, both of his parents were born in Syria, is that right? Or...
No, so both of his parents were born in New York to immigrants who had just arrived over from Syria. So the initial story of our family's journey was really the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Starting with the Balkan Wars and ultimately the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. That's when my great grandparents decided that it was time to go somewhere else. And so they came to New York. And so both of my dad's parents were born on the Lower East Side to immigrants who had recently arrived from the Ottoman Empire.
In the teens or the 20s? Like when did
In
they
the
arrive?
teens.
Okay.
They arrived in the teens, and my grandparents were born in the early 20s,
Okay.
early.
And your mom's family, were they also in New York?
They were also in New York, and they came over from Ukraine and Russia.
Okay. And so then where did you grow up?
I grew up in LA. And so my dad had moved from New York to LA in the late 70s for work, and my mom was born in LA. My grandmother had moved from New York to LA early on, and that was where my mom was born, and her siblings all grew up. So I have a connection both to, deep connections in LA. It's where I grew up. It's where my mom lived her whole life, but also the connection to New York on both sides. And I would always go as a kid to visit my extended family in New York, summers and winter vacations to see my grandparents and my aunts and uncles and cousins over there.
And you have some rabbis and cantors in your family, right?
That's right. So my dad is a rabbi and a hazan, and so I grew up with that strength of tradition, in the house. But actually, my grandfather, my jiddo, he when he fought in World War II in the Normandy invasion, and so when he came back to the States after, he was chosen by the community as someone who had the potential to be a chacham, to be a rabbi. But the economic reality of his life was such that he needed to provide for his family. And so he went into business. And so he was always very, very engaged in passing down the tradition and in having, in learning and just being an active part of the community and an active part of his kids' Jewish education. So, I feel like in my dad's becoming a rabbi, the seeds had been planted previously, and it was something that sort of came to flower. And I think of myself in that same way, that I come from a lineage that taught this and valued this. So my dad was the rabbi at the Sephardic Temple Tiferet Israel in Los Angeles on Wilshire Boulevard, which is LA's historic Sephardic synagogue that was founded by Jews from Turkey and from the island of Rhodes. And so I grew up with a lot of just incredibly beautiful people who had this Ladino heritage, and many of them from Turkey or from Greece, Holocaust survivors even, who spoke Ladino as their first language. And even though that particular linguistic heritage isn't in my immediate family, there is people do say though that Ladino was spoken in Syria until some point in the I think it's the 18th century or 19th century, and it was replaced by Arabic. But there are still families that trace their lineage to Ladino families. For instance, we have cousins with the last name Franco, which is connected to a Ladino family in Turkey, and it's it's all connected. But my dad was the rabbi at that community, and so I became familiar with that particular strain of tradition and grew up just surrounded, especially in LA, the Sephardic community, unlike in New York, which is really Syrian dominated. My Syrian heritage was not as represented in the Sephardic community in LA, so I got that with strength at home. But also, our family picked up customs from the Ladino Sephardic world and also from the North African Sephardic world. Many of my teachers and many of the people who I grew up with were from Morocco and from Algeria and from Tunisia. And so it's a bit of an amalgam, certainly more than you would have if I had grown up in Brooklyn, in the Syrian Sephardic community, where my dad grew up.
But what are some examples of traditions from North Africa or from the Turkish and Rhodes communities that you picked up and used in your home?
Yeah, so a great example of that is the Seder Pesach. We do a traditional Syrian Seder Pesach where we're chanting the Haggadah in the Hebrew and in the Aramaic in the Syrian Nosach, and also in the Syrian tradition you have passages that are, in certain places they'll do the whole Haggadah translated in Judeo-Arabic. We will chant pieces of the Haggadah in Judeo-Arabic, as is our tradition, but we'll also chant pieces of the Haggadah in Ladino, which is something that we picked up from the Ladino Sephardic community. And there are a few other instances. The Ladino in Kelohenu, the Ladino insertion in the Piyut for Havdalah, Hamavdil, um, a few Ladino insertions like that, and many melodies. Many different melodies we've picked up from the Sephardic Ladino community and from the North African community as well. A lot of melodies and a lot of musical traditions. But I'm trying to think of specifically in North African. There are definitely some things that we do that were picked up because the North African community, particularly the Moroccan community in LA, has a lot of strength. And they've been able to preserve a lot of really beautiful tradition in a way that other Sephardic communities in LA maybe haven't, with a strength and a particularism to say that, this isn't just pan-Sephardic, Yerushalmi, this is Moroccan, and this comes from a specific city. And I love that. So I always sought out teachers who could speak to that. So
Wow. And
I learned Moroccan ta'amim and things like that, but I don't use them. I use them more for example and for teaching and not in my own personal kri'ah, but I do use a lot of Moroccan nusach when I'm leading tefillah because the Moroccan nusach in many ways is unlike the Syrian nusach and the Yerushalmi nusach, which the melodies are changing every week according to the Maqam of the week. The Moroccan ways of chanting is a really wonderful way of teaching people the texts because it repeats every week and it can really sort of internalize some of the concepts.
So can you give us an example? I hope you don't mind if I put you on the spot to sing a
Oh,
little.
no. Yeah.
Can you give us an example of Moroccan nusach and Syrian nusach that you use now in your cantorial work?
Absolutely. So let me grab a sidur and I'll give you a little taste.
Okay. Okay, you got your sidur?
Yes. So to give an example. I'll take Nishmat Kol Hai from Shabbat morning tefillah, and I'll give it to you in the Moroccan nosach, and I'll also give it to you with a Syrian nosach because I do incorporate both of these ways of doing it, but it's I think illustrative of the differences. The Moroccan nosach. נשמת כל חי תברך את שמך אדוני אלוהינו ורוח כל בשר תפאר ותרומם זכרך מלכנו תמיד. And it goes through the cycle with that same melody. And then as you go through some of the big ending phrases, the whole kahal would do together. ורובני ברבבות בעמים הטובות, ניסים ונפלאות שעשית עמנו, ועם אבותינו. And everyone does it, and it's predictable in that way, and really, really beautiful, but it has a sort of flow to it that really helps people learn. Whereas in a Syrian tradition, traditionally you would be changing the maqam, the musical mode, every week in accordance with the parasha. So the weekly parasha is associated with a certain musical mode that the community has determined over hundreds of years reflects the themes of the parasha in some way. So as a result, the hazanut gets a little bit more free, but there are melodies that are sung often at the beginning and the end so that the kahal can participate. So if I was to do in Maqam Ajam, which is like a major key, you could do it like this, and this would be a Syrian style. Nishmat kol hai tevarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu veruach kol basar תפאר ותרומם זכרך מלכנו תמיד מן העולם ועד העולם אתה אל ומבלעדיך אין לנו מלך גואל ומושיע פודה ומציל ועונה ומרחם בכל עת צרה וסוכה אין לנו מלך עוזר וסומך, אלא אתה. So you have a melody at the beginning, and then you have hazanut that is basically improvisation within that given mode that the melody sets up. And I use both of those approaches in my hazanut. Oftentimes, if there's a section of the tefillah that in our community I really want people to know and be able to internalize the concepts and take them to heart, especially when you have sections of the tefillah where it's like a list of something, certain characteristics of the Borei Olam or whatever it is, like Adonu Zenu, Tzur Miskabenu, Magen that sort of thing. The Moroccan tradition really helps because you sing it in a way that, Magen Yishenu, Miskabadenu, and it's just it kind of I think emphasizes the concepts, whereas the Syrian is it can be quite elaborate and it can be very beautiful, and I love it. But in terms of being able to teach it to a kahal that is not familiar with it, the hazanut itself takes longer to learn.
So it seems like you're incorporating traditions that come from your family and your childhood community in congregations that are predominantly Ashkenazi.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you also use Ashkenazi nusach?
Yeah, and I can show you, but I as a hazan, my style of hazanut, my pronunciation, my musical style is totally rooted in the Middle Eastern Sephardic traditions. So when I'm using Ashkenazi hazanut, some people might miss it because they might not recognize its application, but it is truly Ashkenazi hazanut. So like Shabbat morning, let's say, right before El Adon, you know. תקן ארוך לך אדוני אלוהינו בעולם הזה ועם זולתך מלכנו לחיי העולם הבא אפס בלתך גואלנו לימות המשיח ומדומה לך מושיענו לתחיית המתים. That's Ashkenazi Hazanut, but it's done with the Sephardic approach.
What's Sephardic about it?
The pronunciation, the improvisation in terms of the like. I'm taking that melody there, that Ashkenazi nusach da na 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 for Shabbat morning. That's in the Arabic and Turkish traditions. That would be called Maqam Nahwand. So I'm applying the kind of melismas and improvisation and approach to building tension and resolution that I learned from Maqam Nahwand and applying it to Ashkenazi music that is in that category. It's not a ridiculous thing to consider these melodies Maqam Nahwand because the Sephardic tradition takes melodies from all different sources and then classifies them ultimately in the Maqam system. In fact, the first time I started doing this, like I felt like I had the permission to do it, is on the famous Pizmonim website from the New York, Brooklyn Syrian community. On their list of Maqam Nahwan melodies, they have Adon Olam Asher Malach. On their list of Maqam Ajam, major melodies, they have Ma'oz Tzur Yeshuati. So when you're thinking in that framework, it doesn't preclude you from bringing things from outside in. And so that for me has been very helpful using this framework of Maqam to bring together things from the Eastern Sephardic traditions, Turkish and Syrian, Yerushalmi, Egyptian, Iraqi, the North African Western Sephardic traditions, Morocco, Algeria, and then Ashkenazi traditions all together. Because the musical framework can hold it.
Wow. So I think we're at a stage in American Jewish history where we're really seeing mixing in ways that we hadn't previously. So I think it's unusual for an Ashkenazi synagogue to incorporate as much Sephardi nusach as you are incorporating, but I can see this happening in smaller doses at other synagogues, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think it's excellent. I think that the more we incorporate Sephardi traditions into the predominantly Ashkenazi institutions, there's so much richness that comes from it because the Sephardi traditions, particularly, and I'll say melodies are one thing, and melodies are very beautiful, and that's sort of where my heart lies is with all of the musical traditions. But once you start going a step beyond that, and you start looking at textual traditions and language and the differences in approach to learning and teaching Torah and different theologies and philosophies that develop, you are expanding the just you're expanding everything in terms of your Jewish life. And it's not all of this is in conversation. So communities that are Ashkenazi communities are rooted in Ashkenazi practice. They already have openings towards Sephardi, like Harambam. Everyone studies Harambam. They're these sort of, or Lecha Dodi, Kabbalat Shabbat, the mystics of Sifat. That's a way into Lurianic mysticism and then the Sephardic iterations of that, and Piyutim and all of that. So if we think of it as sort of expanding upon threads that are already present in all of Jewish practice and making connections and really opening things up to reflect Arba Kanfot, which is really what our Jewish world is. It's an ingathering from all corners, particularly in American Jewish communities that may have been founded by Eastern European Ashkenazim, but that's not the reality of the demographics today, that everyone comes from that root. And even so, most people who come from that heritage are not they're not deeply connected with it anymore as a sort of ethnic heritage. In certain cases, people are, and I think that's wonderful. But for most American Ashkenazim, you know, 3, 4 generations down the line, you know, maybe their pull to the old country isn't as strong as, you know, some of us Sfaradim who really cling to these sort of things. And so at that point, I think you have an opportunity to do things that are spiritually nourishing, you know, first and foremost. These Sephardi traditions are, you know, they bring me a lot of it's just beauty and comfort and all of these things. Aside from the fact that I come from these communities, I value them inherently, and I think that the more communities start to bring that together, the stronger will be in so many ways.
I agree. And what you're pointing to, though, is that this is not a new phenomenon. Like you mentioned that
Not at
the
all.
Piyut website includes Adon Olam and Maoz Tzur in Ashkenazi traditions, and that Ashkenazi traditions include Sephardi liturgy. Also, one you didn't mention is El Nora Alila. Is that
Yes.
true that
Yes. So
yeah,
that's a very interesting
how
one.
did that get into the American conservative Machzor?
El Nora Alila made its way via the UK. So in the UK, where the historic S&P Spanish and Portuguese Western Sephardic community is so deeply rooted that they consider themselves basically Minhag HaMakom of the UK, there's more influence from them on liberal denominations and Ashkenazi Orthodoxy than there necessarily was in recent years in the States. So my understanding is that Nora Alila first became part of the Ashkenazi tradition in the UK, and ultimately from there spread to the States and elsewhere.
Yeah,
But
and
something else I want to note in terms of mixing together is that textually having a sidur, even a prayer tradition that is a mix of both, is something that is several hundreds of years old now. So in our community at the kitchen, we just published a new sidur for our community that is a mixed of nushaot in terms of the text of the sidur. So it weaves together elements of the Sephardi nusach or nushaot, the Ashkenazi nusach, and the nusach or nushaot of the Hasidim. And if you go back and you look at what the Sidurim are and the development of the Sidurim that the Hasidim use, that ultimately comes from the tradition of Isaac Luria, of the Arizal, and the Sidurim that come from that, basically what you have is a Sidur that takes the core of the old Ashkenazi text and alters it in accordance with Sephardic custom when there is a substantial reason to do so, oftentimes mystical or Kabbalistic. So already, you know, in the early days of Hasidut, you have these communities in Eastern Europe, and it's pretty radical. They were all, you know, Ashkenazim, so they're praying Nusach Ashkenaz, and all of a sudden they start changing the Nuschaot to incorporate the mystical understandings of Sephardic rabbis. You know, we think of it, oh, it's just the Hasidic Sidur, but you open it up, it's much more familiar to Sfaradim. there's so many pieces of the text will feel familiar to Sfaradim from our liturgy, whereas many Ashkenazim will see these additions that the Hasidim use, and if they're not familiar with the Sephardic liturgy, they'll be, a little bit more unfamiliar.
Yeah, and even what we think of as Sephardic developed over the years with
Yes,
influence from one Middle Eastern community to another, right?
that's right. And even the notion of a Sephardic tradition really is in some ways it's a homogenizing force throughout the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean Jewish communities. So in my dad's family's community, the Halabi community of Aleppo, Syria, that is very much at this point it's considered to be a Sephardic tradition and a Sephardic community. But before there were Sephardim who came to Aleppo and brought the Sephardic tradition, there was the old Aleppo custom, what's called the Mustarab custom. Mustarab is basically Arabized, is what you would say. So it's Jews who in the land of Israel and Lebanon and Syria and that area have been there since ancient times and ultimately culturally Arabized, but maintained distinct Jewish traditions that ultimately were almost all supplanted by the Sephardic Nusach. And the Sephardic Nusach has supplanted the older customs in places like Iran and the broader Persian community. Bukharian Jews started following Sephardic tradition when a Moroccan rabbi, Abraham Maimon, showed up there in, I think, the 18th century. And all of a sudden, bam, Sephardic Sidurim. Same thing in Yemen. You have the Shami custom in Yemen, which is Shami referring to Bilad al-Sham, which is Syria, land of Israel, the Levant. It's the Jews in Yemen who stopped following the old Yemenite custom, which is more rooted in Harambam, and started following the basically a version of the Sephardic Siddur with the Kabbalistic additions and all of that. And the Livorno printing press was the final element of that, whereas there was a particular edition of the Siddur, the Sephardic Siddur, that was published in Livorno that became the standard throughout the Sephardic world. So if I look at the old Sidurim in my family, and many Sephardic Jews look at old Sidurim in your family, you'll often find that it was an addition of the Livorno Sidurim. So that further sort of homogenized things liturgically.
Wow. And I wonder what role your new Siddur will play in homogenizing the liturgical traditions in egalitarian contexts in America.
Only wonder.
Okay, well, I want to turn now to your ancestral languages.
Yes.
So I assume your great grandparents spoke Arabic or a Jewish
Yes.
variety of Arabic in Syria, and on your other side, probably Yiddish. And so I want you to tell us first to what extent you encountered those languages growing up, and then we'll talk more about the words you've inherited.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say I encountered the same amount of Yiddish as any average American Jew a few generations down the line, with a lot of family in New York. So nothing out of the ordinary. Um, in terms of Judeo-Arabic, though, the it's interesting. So my great grandparents, obviously, they were fluent speakers, and they carried that along with I believe my great grandparents all spoke between 6 and 9 languages because that's what you did at that point in Jewish history in the Ottoman Empire. You spoke Arabic, you spoke Turkish, you spoke Italian, you spoke French, you spoke some Spanish. You had a lot. Those were languages were all necessary. Maybe some Greek or Turkish, um, all necessary for trade and life in multi-ethnic Ottoman lands. And so when they came to the States, they passed down the Arabic to my grandparents pretty well. Especially my jiddo, my grandfather. Jiddo is the Arabic word or Syrian Arabic word for grandfather. So that's how I always refer to him. So my jiddo, alafa shalom, was especially earlier in life was a pretty fluent Arabic speaker, and even later in life was still pretty conversational and had a good knowledge of the language. Um, I don't believe he read though. In fact, I know he didn't read Arabic script. And so this is a common thing that most of the Sephardic Judeo-Arabic speaking communities wrote and read using a sort of altered version of Hebrew script. So if you take the Hebrew alphabet and you assign every letter an equivalent in the Arabic alphabet, it's basically you're spelling everything the same as you would in Arabic for the most part, but you're just using the cognate letters. And in certain cases where you don't have an exact cognate in Hebrew, you would use a letter either with a some sort of diacritic, maybe a dagesh or something, or using different dagesh or refuya versions. But and this also differed place to place, but that's how they wrote that. And so all of the old texts that we have, and any of the liturgical texts that we use in Judeo-Arabic, like in the Haggadah, they're all written in that convention. And by the time you get to my dad, his Arabic that, like, between my grandparents and my dad, that's the point where it stops really being fully like a spoken language. And so my dad has some basic Arabic skills, but it's pretty broken and understands piecemeal. And so I grew up with understanding very basic Arabic, usable basic Arabic, and a whole lot of words of different sorts, just all sorts of different words, religious words, words for food or cultural events, just insults, blessings, words that are useful, I would say. And that, I think, is pretty typical of Syrian Sephardim in the United States, particularly in like centers of the Sephardic community whose family has been in the States for a long time. You'll have a basic command of some, very basic spoken Arabic, and then a lot of phrases, which at this point have become there's sort of a Syrian New York Jewish English, basically.
Yes. And eventually, I hope we'll have on this podcast Isaac Shua,
Oh, yes.
who's compiling a dictionary of Syrian Jewish English, because that's, you might think, oh, it's going to be a dictionary of Judeo-Arabic, but it's not. It's
No,
Jewish. It's words that are distinct that Syrian Jews use within their English.
you have a lot
Um,
of strange uses of Pig Latin, and
Interesting.
yeah, and a lot of initials like Syrian Jews. Like, I grew up referring to Syrian Jews as SYs. So Syrians are SY and Ashkenazim are J dub. And so SY J dub, this sort of initial system is every Syrian Jew knows SY is J dubs.
Yeah, and tell us what those stand for.
SY, it's the initials of Syrian. So Syrian Jews are SY, and then J dubs, Ashkenazim, it probably is JW. And there are a bunch of different theories. I've heard a lot of different theories of how this originated, but I think the one that I heard is that when the Syrians arrived in New York, the Ashkenazim didn't accept them as Jews and would insult them and say, you're Arabs, you're Gypsies, you're Turks, all of these sort of racial insults. And so the Sephardim sort of was okay. They think they're the only Jews. We'll call them. They're the J Dubs. They're the Jews, and we're the Syrians. And so it sort of internalized, and um, I don't know. It definitely reflects that American experience, if that's true. Some people say that's not true. You never know with this stuff.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Okay, I want to turn to your heritage words in particular. So
Yes.
you've already mentioned one of them, which is, well, you mentioned SY and JW, which are heritage words in themselves. You also mentioned Jiddo,
Yeah,
which is
Jiddu.
grandfather. Are there other kinship terms that you use from either Arabic or Yiddish?
Yeah, so Jiddo, and then there's also Sito, which is grandmother. And so those are, it's interesting. I went to in LA a few years ago. I remember I was in a Syrian restaurant that was owned by Syrian Christians, and I was talking with them, and I mentioned the terms Jiddo and Sito, and the woman who was running the restaurant said, "Wow, those terms are from like 100 years ago in like that part of Syria. They would use different terms. So it is, those terms are still in use in the Arab world, but my understanding is they're a little bit archaic and a little bit formal. And I kind of love that because it's like a time capsule of when my family left that part of the world and came to the States. And so, you know, that's I treasure that.
Wow.
And that was the case with in our family and I think in the broader Syrian Jewish community, those are the terms that are used.
Hmm.
Like my great uncle, for instance, and my great aunts, they were Jiddo and Sito to their grandchildren.
Okay. And what about are there any children in your generation? Like, do you have siblings?
I don't.
Okay. And you don't have any children?
No, I don't.
Okay, so if you have children someday, what would you have them call your parents?
I think my mom is Ashkenazi. She'll choose what she wants, but my dad, I know he wants to be Jiddo.
Oh, okay. Um,
Definitely.
so your Ashkenazi grandparents, what do you call them?
So my I never knew my Ashkenazi grandfather, but my Ashkenazi grandmother is my grandma.
Okay.
So
So it's
no Yiddish there or any real particular.
okay. So aside from kinship terms, you mentioned religious and cultural terms. Tell
Yeah.
us some of the Arabic words that you've inherited for those.
Oh yeah, there's a lot. So one I would say for sure is haram. So when something is not allowed, it's forbidden, you say it's haram. And so that is it's an Arabic term. In Islam it's used as a religious term, but also in Judaism it has a cognate, in terms of like the word haram and harem have the same root. It's not allowed. So in the Syrian Jewish world, if something is asur, it's haram. So that's religiously how you would use it, but also it just is used sort of casually. Like, why would you do that? It's haram. Another religious term that I love is adus. So in Syrian Arabic, oftentimes the letter that is a cognate with kof in Hebrew gets dropped. There's Qaf can become aleph in Syrian Arabic. And so it becomes a glottal stop as opposed to a qa in the back of the throat. So that's how you get the instead of qidus or even qadus, you would get adus. And then the sa at the end as opposed to sha is very common in Arabic. Like salam versus shalom. How many words with shin in Hebrew become sa, but adus is I have the memories of, it's my jidda, Allah shalom, before kiddush would yell adus, adus. Yeah,
And
but that's
to clarify for our listeners, that's the blessings that you say over the wine on Friday night and holidays.
that's right. That's right. The blessing for the wine on Shabbat and holidays.
Okay.
Another interesting term is what we call the talit bag. So this one is really interesting because having grown up in a community that had a lot of Ladino speakers, the Syrian Jewish term for a talit bag is a coracha, and that's a Spanish word, but it's not the word that the Ladino speaking Jews use today. So, coracha, I think it means like a purse or it's some sort of bag or something. But today, at least those Ladino speaking Sfaradim that I grew up with from Rhodes in Turkey, they call the talit bag a talega. And so they were always interested to hear this word coracha, which is like some archaic Ladino word that they didn't know. But the Syrians preserved that as the word for the talet bag.
And talet is what Ashkenazim would call a talis, right?
Yes, exactly. So the Sfaradim really the you hear talit now in modern Hebrew, but traditionally and still in Sephardic communities, especially among older people, the vocalization of that word in text was always rendered as talet.
Hmm.
So you'll
Okay, so
still see in New York, you'll see like the Sephardic Heritage Foundation, they'll always spell it talet that way.
mhm. Right, when we think about heritage words, it's primarily the languages that were spoken in the countries our ancestors came from, but it's also distinctive pronunciations of Hebrew and distinctive
That's right.
forms.
That's right. I'll say a couple other words related to religious life and religious practice. One of them is the word for the synagogue, which I grew up always calling Knis. And so the word knis is, for those who are familiar with the Hebrew word for synagogue, bet knesset, you might hear a similarity, and it's because it's the same root. And in fact, the word that I believe that Persian Jews use, kenisa, is also used in Arabic to refer to churches. So there is a sense that that root it's like Knesset, to gather, is at the heart of what we're doing in tefillah. So knis, and the plural of that is kenais. And then another good word is the word for prayer, which is salah. So, and in Syrian, sort of American Syrian parlance, it sometimes ends up being pronounced like sla, you know. How was the sla at Knis, like that? But it comes from the Arabic word salah, which is prayer. And in fact, it's the same root in Aramaic. If you look at the Kaddish, when it says tit kabal tzelot hon, that word of salat is the same as in Arabic.
Excellent. So beyond religious and cultural terms, you mentioned blessings and curses. Tell us about some.
Yes. Oh, there's a lot. So, simple things like calling someone, if you call someone crazy, majnoon or majnoona, that's a really common one. If someone bothers you, majnoon over there. Um, I mentioned haram. A lot of saying mashallah and inshallah. So that's a big part of the, even someone like me who grew up without a lot of Arabic since I was a kid, that's always been a part of the way I speak. And so, inshallah is if God wills it. And so it's kind of the way that some people will say beli neder in Hebrew, without they want to do something, but they don't want to make a promise because there's religious consequences and social consequences to breaking a promise. So you say, are you going to make it to the event later this week? You say, inshallah. It's a way of not saying yes and not saying no. And you can kind of say it in any context. And then mashallah is thanking God, really. So if something good has happened, you say, like the mashallah, everything is good, their health is good. Thank God. It's like saying thank God. And it's also said kind of in a way like you would say something superstitious, like if you see a beautiful baby, you say mashallah, mashallah, in a way that you don't want anything bad to happen, that God will bless. And then there's just so many terms. There's bar minan, which is I think ultimately from Aramaic, and it means God forbid. So you're saying something you don't want it to come to pass. You say bar minan, God forbid. Um, Another beautiful blessing that would always towards my grandmother, really is what I associate this with, my sito, is selim ideki, which, if you're familiar with in the Ladino tradition, where they say "bendichas manos," I believe, may your hands be blessed. Selim ideki is the same thing, but in Arabic. And so it's the same tradition of may your hands be blessed. And this is something that traditionally was said to the woman of the house in the midst of preparing all of the specialties for Shabbat or for Seder Pesach, or all of the incredible food that these Sephardic matriarchs would prepare. They would say, Selim mideki, your hands will be blessed.
Mm. We had a similar term in one of our previous episodes, ashtidek, which is that exact phrase in Iraqi
Right,
Judaic.
I've heard that before. But that's a common feature of all of the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean Sephardic communities, is that this phrase is part of the culture. I do wonder if the Ladino phrase is translated into Ladino from Arabic or from Turkish, or how that came to be. Be interesting to look into that.
We'll look into that. So to what extent do you use all of these words yourself?
I use them a lot. Um, Words like inshallah, mashallah, I use in every context. That's just totally part of the way I speak. Um, some of the religious terms like knis I use. Adus I use, but not habitually. I don't talk when I talk about the kiddush prayer. I usually refer to it as kiddush. Of course, Judo and Sito, um, Bar Minan I use, Haram I use. In thinking of ones that I use, actually, I should mention Hamsa, which is used as sort of a superstition. You don't want something to happen. Hamsa, Hamsa. And another one is Mabruk, which I use a lot. So Mabruk is it's congratulations. It's like Mazal Tov. So if I hear news, of good news, someone's had a baby, there's going to be a bar mitzvah, whatever it is, I'll often say Mabruk and then Mazal Tov.
So I thought it was interesting that just now that you said bar mitzvah, because I guess historically Jews in the Middle East didn't call it that; they called it tefillin, or right?
Yeah, I believe that the Syrians have been calling it bar mitzvah for longer than maybe some of the other groups. I know that for Persians, for instance, that's like quite a recent thing.
Mm.
But in my books of Syrian piyutim that are, they're not that old, but 100, years, you'll see that the piyutim will be listed as a piyut le hatan habar mitzvah.
Hmm.
That's a term that's definitely been used for a while. In fact, there's an incredible, incredible thing that I came across fairly recently through the Pismonim project, the Sephardic Pismonim website, which is a printout for a piyut that was written for my Jiddo's bar mitzvah. And so it's the printout that says, that says in honor of the Hatan Bar Mitzvah, Yitzhak ben Yosef Shasho Levy, and then it's this piyut, and then there's a recording of it on the website. So I now know to sing this piyut that was written for my Jiddo Alav Shalom's Bar Mitzvah.
That's unbelievable. Wow. How did you find that?
I found it just by looking for melodies on the Sephardic Pizmonim website within a certain Maqam, and I was scrolling through the list of the piyutim, and I saw this piyut, and the note was that it said for Isaac Shasho Levy Bar Mitzvah, and I was like, what? And so I looked into it, and that was, I because that name it's not super common, but my thought was, okay, maybe it could have been a cousin or something like that. But I looked at the dates and everything and where it was, and ultimately got in touch with the person who is the sort of webmaster of the site, and it was confirmed that this was my Judos Piyut.
What a find. That's awesome. So we're almost out of time, but I want to make sure that you have time to tell us other things that are important to you about your heritage words and your connection to your ancestral languages.
Yeah, well, these words that I grew up with and the sort of taste that I got of my ancestral language, in particular the Judeo-Arabic, has always drawn me in. And so I hope one day to actually learn. I wonder the best way to go about it because, it seems like there have been several wonderful initiatives of teaching certain dialects of Judeo-Arabic, but I haven't really seen anything around the Syrian dialects. So it's unsure how I will do this, but it's possible that I could learn regular Syrian Arabic and then talk with people in the community. But it's a project. I'd like to get closer to this language because not only because it's so rich culturally and gives such a taste of so many elements of that life that doesn't exist anymore in Syria and the things that were passed down, but also because there's a lot of really beautiful religious and spiritual heritage that's written in Judeo-Arabic and in Arabic in general in Hebrew characters, and I'd like to be able to read that stuff. Saadia Gaon, Harambam, and then also the particular Hachamim of the Syrian Jewish communities. Most of this stuff is not translated, and it's written in Judeo-Arabic. And so I feel like the closer I can get to that language, the better understanding I will have of just all of the elements of intellectual life that it's hard to access of my ancestors and of those
Mm.
communities. But on just on a visceral emotional level, the Judeo-Arabic, it really reminds me of my grandparents, Allah Shalom, my Judo and my Sito. And they're at the foundation of why I do what I do. They're when I was a little kid, they would come to LA from New York for a month at a time, a couple times a year. And I really spent a lot of time with them and really got the feeling for my heritage from them. And so all of this work that I do with the tradition is because of them and in tribute to them and a desire to connect with that heritage. And so, just when I hear the words or I hear the, something being sung or it warms my heart and brings me close. It's one of the reasons I always love whenever I can be in a particularly Halabi, Aleppan Syrian community or synagogue. It's always a beautiful thing to visit because it's a taste of that world.
And you are bringing elements of your ancestral tradition to the broader Jewish world through your
Right. That's right. And I'm half Syrian and half Ashkenazi. I grew up in the traditional Sephardic community and also in the conservative movement and in the pluralistic and progressive community in LA. And that's who I am. It's all there. And so the tefillah that I'm trying to bring and the Jewish life that I'm trying to help facilitate emerging is just all of those things and feels just an outgrowth of who I am and how I grew up.
Well, Asher, thank you so much for all you're doing for the world and for joining us on Heritage Words today.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. It's been a joy and an honor.